I'll give you my experience. It's like a trans woman who is like somewhat attached to my own gender. Growing up, when I saw women, I wanted to like model myself off of them. I wanted to imitate them. And in general, it seems like a lot of people have this experience where if they strongly identify with their gender, they want to have, people that they can model themselves off of. And so having like a man that they can see if they're a man and is going to present them a positive version of what it means to be a man and masculinity, I think that can be really beneficial.
All right, let me see what I can see what I can get at here.
Yeah,
Just
it's a lot.
so a few points out of curiosity. So I agree that it's helpful if you're growing up as a boy or as a girl to have positive role models for the social expectations that you're going to be brought through. But those expectations are the things which I take issue with.
Mhm.
Gender abolitionism isn't really like a today thing, it's like a potential future. And the idea would be that you wouldn't need someone of a particular archetype to mentor you into what it means to be that archetype because the archetype wouldn't exist. So there are, of course, sexual differences. We have a bimodal sexual distribution, which is going to manifest in any ideological system. There's going to be dicks and pussy. That's always going to be the case. Um, but in terms of the roles associated with those characteristics, I feel like it's possible to allow a greater degree of autonomy in which attributes people decide on. Because what gender is functionally is, at least for cisgender people, and of course trans people tend to get this early on before they realize they're trans as well, is, oh, these are the genitals you have, therefore this is what you must be. Therefore, because of your biological configuration, here is the set of expectations upon which we will put upon you. Um, and if you're trans, maybe you can do a little flip switch later on. And I mean, I'm glad people can do that, but it seems like things would be a bit easier if we didn't do so at all. To make gender non-existent and sex as irrelevant to a person's personality traits as race should be, right? We shouldn't go as we used to. You in America, you are black, you are Hispanic, you're a Jew, you're this, that, therefore you must be this thing. We let people decide. So in the absence of those categories being made meaningful now, race is barely a visual distinction. It carries no biological significance. It shouldn't at least affect what people grow up to think of themselves as, what they're capable of doing. We should all be able to do what we want. With gender, right? Say you have a person born, they have parents, but those parents aren't gendered. They have a sex, of course, the parents, but that's it really. Apart from that, they can adopt whatever roles or characteristics they desire. Do you think there would be harm there?
Sorry, repeat that last question.
If you had in some gender abolitionist future, a child born to two parents, the parents are without gender, and so is the child without an ascribed gender. And the parents, maybe one of them or both of them act in ways which are stereotypically masculine or stereotypically feminine, but it's not because that's their gender. There's not like a hard name for that. These would be as essentialist of categories as being a goth or being a gamer. It's like a thing you can run into. It's a habit. It's a lifestyle pattern. But a gender ascribes some kind of essentialist nature to those tendencies. And I guess that de-essentialization is what I'm interested in. Do you think that would be like harmful to a kid to be born into an environment like that?
Um, I'll say this. I think that you can create a gender abolitionist society that is incredibly prosperous, beneficial, and ultimately teaches people, all the lessons that I think gender acts as a heuristic for teaching people. I think there's a question about whether people naturally identify with people of a certain sex based on, I don't know, some biological brain thing, where like it's possible that like, you know, if your brain thinks it's a woman, right? or some part of it, I don't know if I'm saying like should use the word identify, but like some primordial part of your brain is like
Sexed
woman.
female, if the
Yes,
female is
yeah,
sexed,
exactly.
whatever.
If that part of the brain encourages you to identify with people of the female sex, I think that's like a possibility. And if that's true, that like changes things a little bit, but like I'll just assume that that's like not necessarily true, for the sake of the argument. And what I'll say is that gender is really just like a heuristic for teaching people useful like modes of being. And sometimes, those useful modes of being have very toxic elements attached to them. And so I think that like the progressive impulse to question and remove some of those toxic elements is really good. But I think that if you are pushing people to adopt like a gender abolitionist framework, you're also losing a lot of those like stories that model, what is good or bad behavior between people. And that just needs to be replaced with something else, right? So, and I think that's possible. You also talk about like gender as like a strict versus non-strict category. And I would also agree that like it's quite good to allow people to take on positive aspects associated with like either gender. So I don't think people should be like they should feel restricted to one specific gender archetype because of their sex or their gender identity or whatever, right? I think you've got to think of them more like gender roles as more like parables or like fairy tales, which you can teach to people, and they're meant to be sort of like questioned and broken in many ways as you get older, but are just like a fundamental like base that you can build on for like what is good or bad behavior.
Don't get me wrong. I don't mind the idea of people having archetypes of behavior they fall into. I
Mhm.
just don't like the essentialist bit because, we put this on people when they're 0 days old. And there can be a lot of negative consequences to that. Obviously, the existence of trans people is a pretty strong argument in favor of the idea that maybe, slapping gender expectations on somebody from the get-go can not work out great sometimes. But I feel like even if I were born in a society which didn't have a concept of men, I would still probably fall into a lot of the tendencies that I do now. Obviously, I'm biased because I can only see myself through my own eyes, but I feel like I have a predisposition towards some masculine coded characteristics that would be present even if I was born in a forest and never made contact with any people, the stories are important, how to act, how to behave, but we've overridden old stories before. Roman citizens were taught stories about Romulus and the foundation of their society and the meaningful distinction between civilizations that have been pacified by being brought into the empire or the republic and the barbarian hordes outside. And usually you had, morality, ethics coded into these ideas. We did the same with scientific racism as well, where for a long time, white kids were taught how virtue was a white characteristic. So, we model these things. But of course, we always find different ways of telling these stories. The stories are important. It's just we tend to do so through the predominant metric of social control in that time period. And right now, gender is considered a relatively innocuous one. Innocuous, sorry, not innocuous. Um, yeah, there are a lot of parallels there as well. Like, for example, a biological in-sex association. It's possible such a thing could exist without being too troublesome, I suppose. I mean, you wouldn't necessarily need gender if people with big tits just tended to have some kind of innate. I don't know if there's an innate predisposition there. I know studies have shown some element of uh, in-group racial bias very early on. Like black kids tend to have more positive feelings associated with iconography and people who also have dark skin. But it's something that through exposure can go away by I think the age of 2. So it's that might not even be a biology thing. That might be a if you have dark skin, you were probably born to parents of dark skin, and since the first thing most people cling on to is their parents, there's just like a brain rewiring that can take place really early in life, given a decent level of exposure to, to other groups. I wonder if it would go the opposite. Don't daughters tend to hate their mothers and vice versa? I'm not sure.
I don't
That could be
know.
a social thing. I don't know. I don't know if that could be a social, but I'm not sure. Anyway,
I mean,
It's the
I agree with your like
essentialism. Yes.
non-essentialist take, right? The idea that
Yeah,
people
yeah.
shouldn't be like locked into specific roles based on their biology or even by their gender identity, right? Like we can imagine a trans woman who identifies as a woman and, transitions but is like sexed male. That trans woman, I don't think should be like locked in to presenting like an ultra feminine way or even a feminine way at all, right? So I think I'm on board with like your non-essentialist view. I would just say that like gender abolitionism, if it's going to be worked, if it's going to work, it needs to recognize like there is some social reason for why like gender roles are something we see in human cultures across time and history going back forever in different roles and ways and formations. But gender roles continually crop up. And it's because they're a useful way of communicating ideas to people. And so being able to like recognize that and, rewrite old stories with new stories, as you put it, I think can be beneficial as long as we're like cognizant of the stories we're overwriting and cognizant that we're telling good stories to replace them.
No, I agree. Yeah, as long as whatever systems you build are capable of supplanting the positive characteristics associated with the old paradigm. Gender, I think, is a concept, though there have been many incarnations, of course. There are societies that still have like a third gender. People keep posting that meme of like the femboy Polynesian on Twitter. I think Soaked on Left did that, where it was like
Mhm.
they had, like male sexed people who were treated as women and
I
wore
think they're like
dresses and stuff.
Filipino, yeah.
Yeah, it was like pre-colonial before the Spanish, I think, ruined everything. I don't know. Whatever the whatever
Spanish.
right, whatever the case may be, whatever the Spanish people ruined. Yeah, there's I feel like gender is kind of like a very early stopgap, like socially. It's a very easy way of fulfilling given roles. There's a biological difference between males and females and humans. And when you're in like an early agricultural society, those differences kind of mean a lot, you know?
Mhm.
Like when one half of work is hunting or tending to the fields or killing people, and the other half of the work is home rearing and raising like children and giving birth every like 12 months because you need to because children keep dying. It makes sense that social roles associated with sex would crop up and be pretty heavily encoded. There are other reasons for that as well, really complicated anthropological stuff, but
I mean, it
um
also makes sense why you'd see like the rise of highly patriarchal societies, right? If men's labor is like so essential to like war and agriculture and so on, they're going to have a lot of influence in the culture necessarily. And so,
yeah, most leadership roles back then were just like de facto military roles.
right.
People like they would literally fight for who was in charge. I mean, not a fair contest across the sexes in most cases. But of course, nowadays, nobody, at least very few people, like do any kind of physical labor. Like nowadays, most people do service work or office work. I imagine that even in a gender abolitionist world, people with dick are probably more likely to be like doing construction work or soldiering or whatever. But outside of that, I think the majority of stuff we do doesn't necessarily pertain to advantages or disadvantages associated with sex. I'd be okay with some freaky transhumanist bullshit as well. Like, what is it? Not in vitro fertilization, where the eggs and the sperm are removed, and like everyone's born in your little vat tubes or whatever.
I've got the
Yeah,
picture right. I don't know the name
right,
for it.
some Mechanicus shit, I don't know.
Sure.
Eventually we'll see what we can we'll see what we can do. But in the meantime, obviously, gender abolitionism prescriptively should go hand in hand with reducing the negative consequences of gender roles as much as possible. But like it's not about like saying you shouldn't enjoy whatever gender euphoria or enjoyment you get from the system now, right? Like obviously I still call myself a guy, that's sort of a long-term goal.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't think is like a long term goal with an understanding of like some of the social use is necessarily bad to be a gender abolitionist. I mean, I think there's like this interesting fact that we see in the world, which is that in like highly progressive cultures where there's like a very low degree of institutional barriers to women entering different fields, you still see like a high degree of difference in field selection between men and women, as far as like men going into engineering and mathematics and computer science, and women tending to go into fields like sociology or medicine, nursing, and whatnot.
Oh, of course, a lot of that is cultural, right? For example, in computer science and the development of the original home computers, women were equally or overrepresented in early development. It was only after computers began to be marketed as a toy for men that you get this recursive social element where men are raised on computers, so they get into computer science, and then women get like edged out of the field. Lego did that as well, right? Lego was like gender neutral for a really long time, but then they started like edging really hard into more masculine coded toy sets, and then more people at Lego were men because that's how they got into it. They were fans to begin with, right? So there's this recursive thing like air stewards versus stewardesses, you know? No reason on earth why that can't be a 50-50 job, right? I mean, there's plenty of service work where people have to, run about helping dipshits in an enclosed space. Down here on ground level, that's 50-50, right? I mean, like general like restaurateur working or being a waiter or bartender or whatever. But then you put them up in the air and it's like, well, 95% women. And sometimes people say it's because women are a bit smaller, but I think that's cope. It's pretty small behind a bar as well sometimes. Those big clubs, like people squeezing around. I think it's just because for decades we had this, cultural icon of like the hot big titty stewardess, and the blue dress with like the
Mm-hmm.
button, yeah,
Very
and like
sexy.
and yeah, and everyone thinks of that because everyone, they think that's hot, so everyone thinks of that. So now if a guy's looking at job listings and they're thinking like, well, what can I get, like that just feels absurd to them, and people hiring know that their paying customers will want hot big titty stewardesses. So it's this recursive thing.
I
That's
mean,
one of those things that's really slow to undo, though. So it's pretty hard to.
yeah, I mean, there's this like interesting anecdote from my own life, which is when I was a kid, like young, I remember school teachers and school advisors always telling me that like, oh, you're like a math and science kid. Like you do really good on these like classes. You know, you're in a very advanced math class and so on. You're going to go into engineering. It's going to be great, etc. And then I came out when I was like 14, 15, and that narrative like totally shifted. And advisors in my life were like, yeah, you could do whatever you want. Like, you don't necessarily need to go into engineering. Like, it wasn't even brought up that like that was my path forward. And it's not like my grades changed. It's not like I, was not in the same math classes or getting the same scores. It's just that like people saw my presentation differently. And so were pushing me in a different direction.
No, no, yeah, 100%. There's this huge amount of variability there. Um, I remember back when I was young, people kept telling me that I'd be good at sports because I was tall and I'm like a big guy. No, I'm not. And sometimes these people would even see me like do basketball too for like PE in gym. No, I'm fucking not. Like they would watch me fail at this and they'd be like, "Oh, well, let's like no, you're working off preconceptions here." Um yeah, and obviously, the more freedom we have to decide the directions we want to take in life. It's not just like trans people are like the big spotlight culturally right now because, politically sensational and what have you, wave of the future, blah blah. But I think that outside explicitly like being a different gender than the one you were assigned at birth, a ton of people just kind of wake up at some point in their life and realize they are a person they never wanted to be, that there were archetypes they adopted because they felt they had no other choice, and they just kept rolling with it because the more you go in that direction, the more the people around you expect that of you, which makes it harder to pull out of that. And it's almost like a stereotype, right, of people in like their 40s or 50s rediscovering themselves and having a total fucking personality shift. Sometimes people make fun of that, but in many cases, I think that's because they have a secure career and now they actually can be themselves. And it's kind of sad they had to wait that long. There's always going to be some process of ongoing self discovery, but a lot of that is, business guys realizing that being the business guy isn't all there is to life, or housekeeping women realizing they wanted to do more with their life than raising children, or, crap like that. And vice versa sometimes. Sometimes people do the reverse. People realize, oh my God, I wanted kids, is the less external pressure people face, I think, the happier they'll be on average with the choices they make.
Yeah, I think that's true. I will say, I think it's probably much rarer for someone to like get older, get into their 50s and be like, oh, damn, I'm so disappointed that I spent my whole life building like this family and these like strong friendships. And I wish that I had just like done the hustle culture and like
That's
become a
pretty
business
fucking
person.
true. Yeah. No, oh yeah, for sure, for sure. I'm not a big fan of traditional like nuclear family archetypes, but the concept of family or, close bonds in general, yeah. We
Mm.
deprioritize those a ton socially. And women tend to get the blunt end of that as well, right? Because if you're a guy, you can work 8 hours a day and then come home to a family and be a socially normalized family guy kind of dude. But women aren't really afforded that same option. They're expected to be the ones taking care of the kids. Women get judged if they're working. People will be like, "Don't you have a 2-year-old?" And the mom will be like, "Yeah, well, she's being taken care of by some help." And it can get a bit unfair wraparound sometimes. I'm a fan of those big polycule family arrangements that we
Interesting.
used to have.
Can I ask why you're not a fan of the nuclear family?